The heat came off the concrete dock in waves you could see, and I remember thinking that was the kind of thing you'd only notice if you had nothing else to do but stand there and wait for a man to stop laughing at you. It was a Wednesday, the 3rd of July, 1968, and the thermometer nailed to the Cannery's office wall read 101 degrees at 2 in the afternoon. I'd driven the 11 miles from the farm in my uncle's old Ford F1, the 51 model, with the cracked windshield and a tank that never held more than 9 gallons without leaking, and I'd parked it nose first at the loading dock like I belonged there, which I did not yet. He looked at me, the way grown men look at boys who've wandered somewhere they shouldn't be. 50-some years old, sweat-soaked collar, a clipboard he wasn't really reading from. Behind him, bins of peaches sat rotting in the sun, split skins, brown bruises spreading like ink through soft flesh, the whole yard smelling like something between fruit and vinegar already, sweet and a little sick. "You're Otis's boy," he said, not a question. Everybody in Gillespie County already knew who I was by then, the kid who'd inherited 40 acres and 900 trees he had no business running. "Nephew," I said, "Wendell Aycock." He nodded like that settled something. Told me the co-op threw out 500 pounds of culls a week this time of year. Bruised fruit, drops, anything too far gone for the canning line. Said it cost the cannery money just to haul it to the county dump. Said if I wanted to come take it off their hands, they'd let me, long as I paid for my own gas, and didn't expect a dime for the trouble. I said I'd take the deal. He put his hand out and shook mine like he was closing on a Cadillac. I felt the grin more than saw it, the kind of grin a man wears when he thinks he's handed a fool a sack of nothing and called it charity. Told me to pull the truck around back, load whatever I could carry, and not to bother him again unless the truck broke down on his property. I remember the smell most. Sweet rot, hanging heavy in that dead July air, and how it didn't smell like waste to me, the way it must have smelled to him. It smelled like something waiting to be figured out, though I couldn't have told you what, not yet, not standing there in boots 2 sizes too big that used to belong to a man who'd been dead less than 2 months. I climbed into the cab, wiped the sweat off the wheel, and drove home past the water tower with Fredericksburg painted in flaking white letters, thinking about gas money and bruised fruit and a cellar door at the farm I'd never once, in 18 years, been allowed to open. 3 weeks before that handshake, before the smell of sweet rot ever caught in the back of my throat, a letter came to the mailbox on Ranch Road with the Gillespie County seal stamped on the corner, and I stood on the porch of the boarding house in town reading it twice, because the first time didn't feel real. Dated Tuesday, June 4th, 1968. Signed by a lawyer named Delbert Cruz, whose office sat above the feed store on Main Street. It said, in the flat language lawyers use for things that aren't flat at all, that Otis Aycock, my father's older brother, a man I'd visited maybe a dozen times in my life, had died the 2nd week of May, and that I was named sole heir to his property, 40 acres, a house, a barn, and something near 900 peach trees outside town, off the Willow City Road. I didn't own a suit. I wore my church clothes to the reading, and Cruz looked at me over his glasses like he was trying to decide if I was old enough to be trusted with a checkbook, let alone a farm. He said the note at First State Bank of Fredericksburg was 2 months behind, $411 owed against a mortgage Otis had taken out in 1961 to replace half his irrigation line, and the bank's patience, he said, wasn't the kind that grew on trees. I drove out there myself, in that same 51 Ford, the day after the reading, Saturday, June 8th. The gate hung open on one hinge, and the fence past it sagged so bad in 3 places a calf could have stepped clean over it without trying. The orchard looked worse than I remembered from when I was a boy. Rows of Alberta and Alberta peach trees gone shaggy and wild, unpruned 2, maybe 3 years, suckers shooting up from the roots like the trees were trying to multiply out of spite. Fruit lay rotting in the grass, more on the ground than in the branches it looked like, and the smell of it followed me all the way up to the house. The house itself wasn't much. One story, tin roof rusted the color of an old penny, a porch that dipped in the middle like a saddle. I stood on it a long while before I went in, looking at the barn behind it, and past the barn, a low stone building half sunk into the hillside, with a door, I remembered being told, more than once, as a boy, not that one, not ever that one, not while I'm living. Otis had said it soft each time, never angry, just final, the way a man talks about a war he doesn't discuss. I was 18 now, and he wasn't living anymore, and the door didn't have a lock on it at all. Just a latch, rusted stiff, waiting on somebody who'd finally been given the right to lift it. I left the door alone that first evening and walked the orchard instead, because a man who can't count his own trees has no business opening doors he was warned off of. I went row by row with a stub pencil and the back of the lawyer's envelope, tallying as I went, and it came to something near 900 trees by the time I'd crossed the last terrace above the creek. Mostly Alberta, a good number of Alberta mixed through the north end, where the ground ran sandier, and every one of them wanting a saw taken to it. Some had gone so long without pruning that the centers had closed up dark, no sun getting to the fruit at all, and what fruit there was had dropped early and lay split open in the grass, working with wasps. I stood at the fence line counting flies instead of trees for a minute, just to keep from thinking about how much rope a man could hang himself with on a place like this. By the time I came back around to the barn, the sun was low and orange through the dust, and I found a crowbar hanging on a nail inside the door, next to a coil of wire gone brittle, and a horse collar nobody had used since Roosevelt was governor of somewhere. The crowbar had Otis's father's initials burned into the handle, W.A., same as mine near enough, and that felt like a permission slip I hadn't asked for but wasn't going to refuse. The cellar door was set into the hillside stone, low enough I had to duck, with hinges rusted to the color of dried blood and a latch swollen shut, with 40 years of hill country humidity working its way into the iron. I got the flat end of the bar under the latch plate and leaned my whole weight into it, and it gave all at once with a crack that sounded like something breaking that wasn't metal, and for a second I thought I'd pulled the whole frame down on myself. I stood there a minute after, breathing harder than the work called for, listening to the door settle on hinges that hadn't moved since before I was born. It smelled like wet limestone and something sweeter underneath that, something fermented and old that didn't belong to any crop I knew how to name yet. There was no lock inside waiting to explain itself, no chain, nothing that told me why a grown man would keep his own nephew out of a root cellar for 18 years running. Just dark and cool air pooling out around my boots like water finding the low ground, and somewhere back in it, past where the last of the daylight gave out, the shape of something squat and round sitting up on a shelf like it had been waiting on somebody to come ask it what it knew. I went back to the truck for the flashlight, the 6-volt one with the cracked lens that Otis kept clipped under the dash, and when I came back, the cellar hadn't changed, but I had, standing there a second time with a light in my hand instead of a pry bar. The beam ran along shelving built out of scrap lumber, warped with 60 years of damp, and most of it was empty, just pale rings on the wood where jars used to sit. One shelf wasn't empty. Set back against the limestone wall, low enough that I had to crouch to see it square, sat a crock about knee-high, maybe 15 gallons by the look of the belly on it, glazed the color of weak tea, with a wax seal gone brittle and cracked around the lid like dried mud in August. I didn't touch the seal. Something about it looked like it had been sitting there long enough to earn the right not to be disturbed by somebody who didn't know what he was disturbing. Next to it, wedged between the crock and the wall where it wouldn't slide, was a notebook. Leather cover, or what used to be leather, gone stiff and pale at the corners, the kind of stiff that means water got into it once and then it dried and forgot how to be soft again. I picked it up careful, the way you'd pick up a bird that flew into a window, and the spine cracked a little when I opened it, a sound like a knuckle popping. The handwriting wasn't Otis's. I knew Otis's hand from the letter the county lawyer sent me, blocky and hard-pressed like he was mad at the pen. This was smaller, looped, slanted hard to the right, a woman's hand, and at the top of the first page, in ink gone brown as the crock itself, it said, "Peach vinegar, begun this 3rd day of July, 1924. I crouched there on my heels in the cellar dirt reading by flashlight, and half of it I couldn't make out at all. Water had gotten to some pages worse than others, blooms of mildew eating whole lines down to ghosts, words that started clear and just gave up halfway through. Starter must be fe. And then nothing. Do not let it. And then nothing. What I could read talked about mother crocks and daughter crocks, about carrying something over from one batch to the next, like you'd carry over a sourdough, about fruit that had to be soft, had to be past what a body would want to eat, before it was any good for this at all. I sat with that a long minute, the flashlight beam shaking a little on the page, not from the cold. I carried the notebook up out of the cellar the next morning, a Thursday, the 27th of June, with the banknote sitting in my head like a stone I kept swallowing, and it kept coming back up. Farmers and merchants wanted its first payment the 15th of August, and I had a truck that ran on borrowed gas money and 900 trees that weren't going to yield me a dime till the peaches came in proper, if they came in at all under my hand. So I drove the 2 miles down to the Kessler place, with the notebook wrapped in a dish towel on the seat beside me like it might spill. She was out at her clothesline when I pulled in, a small woman bent permanent at the shoulders, pinning sheets with wooden pins gone gray with age. 81 years old, she told me once, though I never asked. She'd known my great-grandmother, and she'd known Otis since before either of them had all their teeth. She took one look at the croc's photograph I'd drawn crude on a feed sack. I hadn't wanted to haul the thing itself over bad roads, and she didn't even need the drawing once I said, "Stoneware, 15-gallon, cellar, under the Aycock place." She set down her wooden pins. "That was Loretta's," she said, "Otis's mother. My great-grandmother, dead 30 years before I was ever born. Loretta Aycock made vinegar in that cellar from the time she was younger than you. Sold it out of the back of a wagon at the courthouse square, before the wagon was a truck, before the truck was scarce on gas in the war." I asked her what happened to it. She looked past me toward the road a while before she answered, like the answer was out there somewhere in the dust. 29 happened to it. 31, 32. Nobody's got money for vinegar when they can't buy flour. Loretta let the crocks go dry. A woman can only carry so much forward when there's nothing left to feed it. Otis never started it back up. I don't believe he had the patience for it, God rest him. He was a good man with a peach tree and no patience at all for anything that took longer than a season to prove itself. She told me the starter, whatever was left of it, was carried mother to daughter, crock to crock, for years before that. That a woman didn't buy yeast for it. She kept a piece of the last batch alive in the new one, same as you'd save back sourdough, and that if there was anything living in that 15-gallon crock in my cellar, it had a lineage older than the both of us put together. I asked her if she thought it was still alive. She looked at me like that was a fool question, and maybe it was. "Won't know till you feed it," she said, and went back to her wash. I walked back to the truck with her words sitting in me like a stone dropped in a well, still falling, no sound yet of it hitting bottom. "Won't know till you feed it." I turned that over the whole half-mile home, gravel popping under the tires, the sun already flattening everything gold at 4 in the afternoon. I went straight to the cellar, pulled the notebook out again, held it under the bare bulb, and read the same line 3 times before it landed different than it had the first pass. Fruit must be soft, bruised, near spoiling. Sound peaches will not draw the must right. They hold too tight to their own sugar. I'd read that sentence a week before and thought it was just how she wrote, a little strange, a little old-fashioned. Now I understood it plain. She wasn't being poetic. She was being exact. The whole method wanted fruit that was already halfway gone. I sat down on the cellar steps and let that settle. Every peach on my 40 acres worth selling, I was already selling, or trying to buyers who didn't want a boy's word on a scale. Every peach not worth selling, I was dumping in a gully behind the barn because there was nothing else to do with it. That gully had a smell to it by late June that could about knock you down. And 2 miles up the road, the cannery had the same problem times 100. Bins of culls too soft or too split to run through their line, paying somebody to haul it off just to keep the flies down. I'd been looking at rotten fruit as a nuisance, the whole time I'd been looking at it as anything at all. I didn't sleep much that night. Lay there running numbers. I didn't have any real right to run yet. How many bushels a cannery that size probably culled in a week? How far 15 gallons of starter could stretch if I fed it right? Whether Otis's barrels in the loft over the wagon shed were still tight enough to hold liquid, or just tight enough to hold spiders. Somewhere past midnight, I quit pretending I was going to sleep and lit the lamp and wrote it down instead, the way Otis's mother must have written down her own thinking 40-odd years before me, in the same cellar, probably by the same kind of light. By morning, I had a plan that sounded, even to me, half foolish and half like the only sensible thing anybody'd said around that farm in years. I was going to drive to the Fredericksburg Fruit and Cannery Co-op and ask them to give me, for nothing, the very fruit they were already paying to get rid of. I put on my cleanest shirt, which wasn't saying much, and I told myself the worst they could do was laugh. The drive into town took 11 minutes, and I spent every one of them rehearsing words that fell apart as soon as I tried to say them out loud in the cab. Alone, windows down, the truck smelling like it always did, old motor oil and dust, and the ghost of every load of feed it had ever carried. The Fredericksburg Fruit and Cannery Co-op sat off the highway on the north side of town, a long tin-roofed building with a loading dock and 3 trucks backed up to it, and the smell hit me before I even parked. Sugar going sour, fruit going soft, a smell like a peach orchard's version of regret. The foreman was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with a co-op cap pushed back on his head and forearms burned the color of saddle leather. He was talking to 2 other men when I walked up, and he didn't stop talking to look at me right away, which told me something about where I stood before I'd said a word. I told him who I was, Otis's nephew, ran the place out past the Willow Creek turnoff now. He knew the name, or knew enough of it, and something in his face shifted from bored to faintly entertained. I told him what I wanted, the culls, the bruised ones, the split ones, whatever they were already throwing out. I'd haul them myself, my own gas, my own truck, and all I wanted in return was to keep whatever I hauled. He looked at the other 2 men before he looked back at me, and that was the part that stayed with me longest. Not what he said, but that look, the kind grown men trade when they've already decided something's funny and are just waiting for permission to laugh out loud. "You want the rot," he said, like he was making sure he'd heard right. I said I did. He spit once, off the side of the dock, and said if I wanted to burn my own gas hauling garbage off his hands, that was a deal he'd shake on all day long, and he put his hand out like it cost him nothing, because it didn't. We shook on it. "First week of July," he said. "Come Monday." I came Monday. The 51 Ford backed up to that same dock at 8 in the morning, and 2 cannery workers loaded bushel after bushel of split, bruised, sweating peaches into the bed, while a third leaned on a post and grinned at me the whole time like I was the best thing that had happened to his week. Somebody said something behind me I didn't catch and didn't ask to have repeated. I just climbed in, started her up on the second try, and pulled out past the dock with 600 pounds of what the whole town had already decided was worthless, riding low in the bed behind me, sweet and rotting, and mine. The barrels came from a widow near Stonewall who'd let her husband's winery go quiet 3 years back. The tanks sitting empty in a shed with wasps living in the bungholes. $6 apiece, she said, and looked at me like she expected me to argue. I didn't. I loaded 4 of them into the truck bed on a Wednesday and drove them home slow, feeling every rut in the road through the springs, worried the staves would crack before I got them to the cellar. The notebook said to crush the fruit whole, pit and skin and all, and pack it loose in the barrel with a gallon of the old starter poured over top, then leave it. Not stirred daily, not checked hourly, left. That word sat wrong with me at first, because everything else on that farm needed watching every hour, or it went bad, but the notebook was firm about it, in a handwriting that didn't waste ink arguing twice. I crushed the first batch by hand in a wash tub using a hoe handle worn smooth by somebody before me, and packed it into the first barrel on the 2nd of July, a Tuesday, 96 degrees by 10 in the morning, according to the thermometer nailed outside the kitchen door. I set the barrel in the cellar where it stayed cooler, 68, 70 degrees, even when the house upstairs was an oven, and I went back the next morning half expecting to find nothing had happened at all. It hadn't. Not on the 2nd day, not on the 4th. I lifted the burlap I'd tied over the top and smelled peaches going soft, nothing more. No bite to it, no life. I started to think the yeast my great-grandmother had carried crock to crock for 40 years had finally died somewhere along the way. Maybe in the 2 months the place sat empty after Otis passed. Maybe longer than that. Maybe it had been dying slow for years and nobody noticed because nobody was making vinegar anymore to notice with. I kept hauling culls 3 mornings a week regardless. The foreman had stopped grinning by the 2nd trip. Not because he respected the work, but because a joke only stays funny while somebody's watching, and nobody but the 2 loaders bothered to watch me back a truck up to that dock a 2nd time, let alone a 3rd. I'd load. I'd drive the 11 miles home with the smell of ruin following me the whole way, and I'd crush another wash tub and add it to whichever barrel wasn't already full, and every morning before chores, I went down into that cellar and pulled the burlap back and waited for something my great-grandmother's handwriting swore would come. On the 9th day, a Thursday, I smelled something sharp under the sweetness. Not vinegar yet, but not nothing either. The sharp smell got stronger through that Thursday and into Friday, and I let myself believe the worst of it was behind me. I was wrong about that, the way I was wrong about a lot of things that summer, but this one cost me. It was the 2nd barrel, the one I'd filled first, back in the 2nd week of July. On the 11th day of August, a Sunday, I pulled back the burlap and the smell hit me before I saw anything. Not sharp, not sweet, just wrong. Underneath, where the fruit met the air, a gray-green skin had formed across the whole surface, thick as a bedsheet, with a smell like a wet basement that's never seen sun. I stood there over that barrel longer than I should have. 91 degrees outside already, and I was sweating through my shirt in a stone cellar that stayed cool as a well, and none of it had anything to do with the heat. I thought about hauling the whole barrel out to the field and dumping it. I thought about the 2 barrels still going strong, and whether they'd end up the same way given enough time, whether the whole idea had been a boy's foolishness dressed up as inheritance. I sat on the cellar steps a good 20 minutes with my head in my hands before I made myself go back to the notebook. I'd read the main recipe a dozen times by then, the ratios, the water, the muslin, the 40-year-old yeast passed crock to crock, but I hadn't paid much mind to the margins, where my great-grandmother had crowded in notes in a smaller hand, added later, in different ink. Down near the bottom of the 2nd page, squeezed between 2 lines like she'd thought of it after the fact, she'd written, "Skim the cap every morning without fail, or it will turn on you inside a week." Nothing more than that. No explanation of what the cap was or why it mattered, like she figured anybody doing this work would already know. I hadn't skimmed anything, not once. I'd been checking the barrels, smelling them, stirring when the note said stir, but I'd let whatever formed on top just sit there, figuring it was part of the process same as the rest of it. I went back down and skimmed the 2 good barrels first, careful, working a flat wooden paddle Otis had left hanging by the cellar stairs, lifting off the thin film that had only just started forming and hadn't yet turned. Then I stood over the ruined one a long while before I hauled it up the steps myself, alone, and dumped it behind the barn where the chickens wouldn't get at it. 2 barrels left. I skimmed them every morning after that, before chores, rain, or heat, without missing a day, and I didn't let myself think past the next morning's skim for a good while. By the last week of August, the smell in the cellar had changed again, gone past sharp into something rounder, something that caught in the back of my throat instead of the front. I'd stopped calling it peach mash in my head. It was vinegar now, or close enough that I didn't argue with myself about it. I pulled a jar sample on a Tuesday, held it up to the one bare bulb hanging over the barrels, and it came out the color of a new penny left out in the rain, amber, with a little cloud of sediment that settled fast when I let it sit. I tasted it off a spoon. It near took the top of my head off. Tart in a way that wasn't ugly, just honest, and under that a sweetness that hadn't burned off, the way the notebook said it wouldn't if you'd done the skimming right. I didn't say anything to anybody. I didn't have anybody close enough to say it to, except old lady Kessler 2 farms over, and she'd already told me what she knew. I drove into town on a Thursday and bought 40 half-pint bottles from the hardware store, the plain kind with the flip-top wire clasps, 79 cents apiece, more money than I liked spending on bottles when I still owed the bank on the truck. I filled 12 of them off the 2 good barrels, careful, straining through cheesecloth Aunt May at the general store gave me for nothing when I told her what it was for. I wrote the label out myself at the kitchen table under the kerosene lamp, block letters, no fancy script, because fancy wasn't Otis, and it wasn't his mother either. Aycock's Hill Country Peach Vinegar. Nothing else on it. No date, no county, no cannery name, because there wasn't one to put yet. The Gillespie County Fair posted its categories in the Fredericksburg Standard the first week of September, and I read the notice 3 times standing in the feed store before I let myself believe what it said. Blind tasting. Vinegar, homemade and commercial. Entries accepted through September 20th. 3 commercial brands were already down as entered. Heinz, a Fisher and Wieser fruit vinegar out of Shiner, and a co-op brand I didn't recognize, something out of Kerrville. I stood there with the paper in my hand and thought about the foreman's face at the loading dock back in July, the way he'd grinned like he'd gotten the better end of a joke he didn't have to explain to me. I filled out the entry card in pencil, then went back over it in pen so it wouldn't smear on the drive over. Category, vinegar, homemade. Entrant, Wendell Aycock. Product, Aycock's Hill Country Peach Vinegar. I paid the 50-cent entry fee out of the coffee can I kept in the pantry, and I didn't tell a soul in town what I'd put in. The judging tent sat behind the exhibit hall, canvas gone gray with age, and I got there Saturday morning before the doors opened to the public, because entrants were let in early to watch numbers get assigned. Each bottle got a card with a letter on it instead of a name, so the judges wouldn't know Heinz from a 50-cent county entry. Mine was labeled D. I watched a woman in a green dress pin the card to my crock-poured bottle and felt something in my chest go tight, the way it had the first time I climbed into the cellar with a lantern and didn't know what I'd find. There were 4 judges, 2 from the extension office in Kerrville and 2 local, a home economics teacher and a man who ran the feed store 2 doors down from the newspaper. They worked a long folding table with little paper cups, a pitcher of water between tastings, spitting into a coffee can when the acid got to be too much. Nobody talked. I stood at the back of the tent with my hands in my pockets and watched the home economics teacher taste D twice, then a 3rd time, writing something on her card and not looking up. They posted the results at 11, tacked to a corkboard by the hall entrance. I didn't push through the crowd right away. I let 3 other people read it first, and when the crowd thinned I walked up and found it myself. First place, Vinegar, Homemade and Commercial. Entry D, Wendell Aycock, Aycock's Hill Country Peach Vinegar. I read it twice the way I'd read the fair notice in the feed store, not trusting my own eyes the first time through. Heinz took 3rd. The Kerrville co-op didn't place at all. I was still standing there when I heard boots on the gravel behind me, slow and deliberate, and I didn't need to turn around to know whose they were. He had his hat in his hand, which I'd never once seen him do, and his face had gone the color of a fence post left out in July. He read the board over my shoulder, like he was hoping the letters would rearrange themselves. "Didn't figure," he said, and stopped. "No, sir," I said. "I didn't figure you would." He turned the hat over in his hands, working the brim between his fingers the way a man does when he's deciding how to ask for something he doesn't feel entitled to. He looked at the bottle sitting up on the display shelf next to the ribbon, my uncle's handwriting practically visible through the glass, even though it was my own printing on the label now. "That name," he said, nodding at it. "Icox. We could talk about putting the co-op's name alongside it. Distribution. You'd still get your due." I looked at him a long moment before I answered, and somewhere behind us, a hog was squealing in the livestock barn like it already knew what I was going to say. "No," I said. "The name stays mine." He stopped working the hat brim. "Just mine," I said again, in case he thought I hadn't heard him right the first time. "It's got my great-grandmother in it and my uncle in it, and there's no room on that label for a co-op that called it rot back in July." He didn't argue. I'll give him that. He just stood there a second longer, looking at the ribbon, looking at the bottle, looking at me, like he was recalculating something he'd already added up wrong once that summer. "Fair enough," he said finally. "Fair enough. But I'll tell you what, you keep hauling those culls, and we'll pay you for it. 2 cents a pound. Real contract, signed at the co-op office, not some joke at the loading dock." I thought about the first week of July, the way he'd laughed and waved me toward that bin, like he was doing me a favor letting a kid clean up his mess for free. I thought about the gas money, $6, $7 a trip, and how I used to count it out on the seat of the truck before I left the house. 2 cents a pound wasn't a fortune. It wasn't supposed to be. It was the difference between a joke and a business, and I understood the difference was the whole point. "I'll sign that," I said. We shook on it right there next to the vinegar table, and I want you to know his hand was steadier than mine, but not by much. I drove home that evening, the long way, past the cannery, same dock, same gravel lot, same tin roof, throwing back the last of the light. Nothing about the building had changed. What had changed was sitting in the truck bed behind me, empty barrels I'd be filling again come next July, this time on paper, this time with my name spelled out next to the co-ops on a contract instead of laughed off across a loading dock. I think about that cellar sometimes, the smell of it before I ever knew what was down there. Dust and stone and something sweet gone patient with age. 44 years that crock sat sealed up in the dark, waiting on somebody to open the right drawer, read the right handwriting, trust an old woman's memory over a man's grin. I expect there's a cellar like that somewhere near you too, a trunk nobody's opened, a ledger with a name in it you've never asked about. It doesn't announce itself, it just waits. If you've got one of those, or you've already found what was in it, tell me about it down in the comments. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, go on and subscribe. There's plenty more sitting in the dark, waiting on somebody patient enough to go looking.